All right, students, I'm going to be lecturing today over chapter 11. The title of this chapter is Light in the Darkness, Limits of Progressive Reform, 1900 through 1932. Okay, so just ahead of time, if you don't know what progressivism is, look into it. It's a movement, what the word means, etc. Like anytime you come across a word and you've never heard it, look it up. Okay, so if you're not familiar with that word, and I'll be going into it later in the lecture, but it'd be a good time for you to do a quick Google search. So we're going to talk about New South Arkansas, and covering a lot of time in this lecture. We're going to start off mid-1890s and work our way through to 1920. Okay. So from the mid-1890s through 1920, the economy in Arkansas did improve. Okay, there was an increase in demand for Arkansas products. There was an improvement in the number of acres in cultivation. Crops were becoming more diversified instead of reliance just on one crop, cotton. And Arkansas is integrating into national markets more and more. Okay, now also during this time period, mid-1890s through 1920, you have World War I take place. So urbanization and integration into national markets and culture is taking place. Rural free delivery is changing the face of the countrysides across the state and across the United States in the South. World War I broke down isolation in the South, and people who had lived a rural Arkansas life were suddenly drafted or enlisted or volunteered for the military to go to these foreign locations and expanded their life experience. This time period is also a golden age for many white Arkansans. There's still a lot of problems going on in our state. Unequal prosperity, smaller farms, increased farm tenancy, labor problems. The timber industry is exhausting state forests. And breaking down of old ways led to a lot of racial tensions after World War I. I just had someone on my podcast and shared an article as a professor from Ohio State University named Mitchell Lerner, Dr. Mitch Lerner. And he goes into historically and even talks about some Arkansas history about, and he's writing a book right now about how throughout our nation's history, African Americans who fought in wars did not achieve more civil rights after that, right? That was kind of always the thought. Even if you remember, we've talked about African Americans in this class I teach since the American Revolution, and them being, sort of like, hey, fight for your freedom at that time. And, it goes on. But if you look at World War I, World War II, Vietnam, it's always, there's always some sort of issue going on with how African Americans are treated, right? And we'll be talking about that more and more. And I hope that you'll be able to kind of see when we start talking about the Elaine Massacre and race riots that happened in 350 cities across the United States after World War I, sort of the bigger picture about what I'm talking about. So in the 1890s, New South Jim Crow would have separate train cars for African Americans, right? An African American leader named Booker T. Washington, who's a former slave, urged African Americans to stay in the South, learn a trade. And Washington wanted people of his race to be allowed to earn a living and receive an education, but not press for social or political equality. They were to be separate but allowed, right? This comes from this idea here comes from a speech that he gave, known as the Atlanta Compromise, that was the basis for an agreement between Washington, the president of the Tuskegee Institute, other African American leaders, and white Southern leaders. W.E.B. Du Bois, he was a freedman challenged Washington and demanded all the same rights and demanded them now, right? So this is when African-American ideologies begin splintering. Washington and Du Bois couldn't agree on curriculum for schools, whether they would be trade-based schools, etc. And initially, some people did side with Washington and then changed, right? They sided with him initially and then, sort of came to the realization that they wanted more rights than Washington was calling for. Okay. So this is a very low point for African Americans. Okay. In 1891, state legislature passed a separate coach law, meaning that the railroads, like I mentioned earlier, were to be separate as well. In 1896, nationalism creates some challenges. Plessy versus Ferguson was deliberately challenged in a Louisiana court. Now, Plessy v. Ferguson had decreed separate but equal was constitutional. This allowed, this applied to restaurants, theaters, transportation, schools. So Plessy versus Ferguson held up until Brown v. Board of Education, where separate but equal was deemed unconstitutional. So let's get into talking about Jeff Davis. Okay, Jeff Davis is a racist governor who was born in the Civil War in 1862, grew up during the Reconstruction era in Dover, Arkansas. He was educated in Russellville. I'm sitting in Russellville right now. Drove through Dover a couple of days ago. So right here nearby my home base. But, like Jeff Davis, interesting character that we're going to be talking about. And just sort of how I started off describing him. I mean, it's just what I had in my Arkansas history notes. And, I talked to one of the authors of the textbook quite regularly, and he's the guy that I got the note from. And that is not uncommon, right? We talked about when we were finishing up Reconstruction period, how many former Confederates became governors in our state's history in the later 1800s after the Civil War. So Jeff Davis is a racist governor. He was born in 1862, but he's coming of age during the Reconstruction era. He couldn't spell, so he can't go to West Point. He was known for being able to speak on the fly anywhere. He ends up going to Vanderbilt Law School at age 19, and he has 12 kids, 8 of which live to adulthood. He was a Democrat, and he ran on a platform of racism and reform. By 1890, he was the prosecuting attorney in Pope County, and he's what they call a free silver Democrat. If you've never heard of it, look it up. And in 1898, he won the Attorney General. He would file suit against insurance companies because the companies would drop the entire state from fire insurance. In 1900, he ran for governor, but the other person running died. Newspapers circulated this story, bringing attention, which only helped Davis, right? His accomplishments as governor weren't significant. He was known for excessive drinking, a prison scandal, the anti-insurance law was causing problems, and the Baptist Church in Little Rock dispelled him, right? Davis infuriated people. For example, a man named Judge Wood threw a punch at him on a platform at an event, which he dodged, but fell off the platform in doing so. Davis talked to Arkansans in a language that they could understand. Even those who didn't like him said he put on a good performance. Racism fueled his entire third term while running for governor, and he wanted the primaries to be open to everyone because he thought he could win. A guy named Senator Berry is running against him. So Jeff Davis is now going to the Senate, but didn't want to lose the state. So in 1906, he supports a man named Little to run for governor. Little ends up having to step down due to mental issues. Now, the new governor hated Davis and even moved Davis's picture from the men's bathroom. In 1905, Davis was supposed to give a welcoming address, but declined to go to dinner because of Pal Clayton's presence. And this is at a time where Roosevelt is speaking, right? Davis declined to go to dinner again because of Pal Clayton. If you remember, Pal Clayton is a former Union cavalry officer who was governor of Arkansas and instituted martial law. And Jeff Davis openly talked about lynching as an acceptable act. So let's get into progressivism. Okay. There was some change for the better. All right? It wasn't all people like Jeff Davis fist fighting with people on stages in front of their constituents, right? A progressive movement is going to move Arkansas in a different direction, right? It's going to steer the state a little bit. So the progressive movement was an attempt by various interest groups to come to terms with society amidst dramatic change and transformation. Large corporations, industrialization, and increase in urbanization threatened the status quo. And people who responded to these changes, or people did respond to these changes by trying to create reforms. Now, due to economic issues in Arkansas, the state lagged behind other states, many other southern states, and particularly northern states, in progressive reform. During this time, education became very important, was emphasized, as well as the environment. African Americans are left out, and race is omitted from the ideals of the progressive movement. Women achieved the right to vote following World War I with the passage of the 19th Amendment. And an emphasis is placed on expertise or training, education, efficiency, and the environment during the progressive movement. Prohibition comes out of the progressive movement, which leads to a rise in bootleggers in the South as a consequence. If you live in Arkansas now, you know that we still have dry counties. We still have, we talked about blue laws recently, but certain businesses not being open or allowed to do things on Sundays or serve alcohol on Sundays, et cetera. Now, some of that is starting to change, right? But these are the sort of, we've been talking about the origins of these traditions in the last couple of lectures. Progressives were optimistic that humans could make society whatever you wanted to be by bettering education and by bettering people's environment, that you could change them, right? Progressivism upholds the idea that mankind is perfectible and changeable. If you could change the environment, you could change the person, right? So this blending of government and progressivism, okay? So I want you guys that are listening to this kind of think critically about that and ask yourself the question of whether or not, and if they have, is government capable of administering these type of changes, right? And do they work? This is the big divide in politics is, do we need more government or less government? Progressives are wanting to use the government to create what they perceive to be positive change. They felt the government should be involved in society. So think about, should the government be very involved in society and people's lives? Now, progressives believed in things like conducting meat inspections, for example. Anti-gambling comes out of this time period. Think about our lottery. That is the first allowance in Arkansas history of statewide gambling, right? This happened in 2008 with the passage of proposed constitutional amendment number 3, which amended the state's constitution to make a statewide lottery program legal. The whole House it comes out of this time period. Look into that. I will see if I can't find an encyclopedia article to share with you on the Hull House. But women's houses spring up in an attempt to attack the evils of society, right? And Hull House is one of those examples. Now, in Arkansas, the three major goals of progressivism are better roads, better schools, and better health. Okay, so moving on now to another important figure. It's going to be George Washington Donahey. His years are 1856 to 1937. He's born in Louisiana. He settles in Conway. Donahey is who really brought progressivism to Arkansas, as he served two two-year terms as the 22nd governor of Arkansas from 1909 to 1913. He spent 1 year at the University of Arkansas in Fayetteville. He ends up becoming a carpenter and works his way to becoming a respected major contractor. He lived in Conway with his wife, Lavinia Wallace, was instrumental in bringing universities to Conway. He became active in local politics and helped rid Conway of its saloons. So no university is going to come into a town if there are saloons in the town. Now, look on the Arkansas Encyclopedia online, and you can read about this issue with saloons. I've shared that article in Blackboard for my students. So he becomes a wealthy railroad contractor from 1899 to 1903. Moves to Little Rock, continues to pursue politics, entered the Democratic primary as a candidate for governor in 1903, in which he defeated William F. Kirby. Kirby was sponsored by Jeff Davis and proved to be the first defeat for someone from the Davis political machine. He easily defeated Republican candidate John Worthington in the general election of 1908 with 71% of the vote. And in 1909, this is one of the big takeaways here, he established 4 agricultural schools. These schools would develop into colleges, and they are Arkansas State University, or ASU, at Jonesboro, Arkansas Tech University in Russellville, which is my alumni, where I received my bachelor's and master's degree from, Southern Arkansas University in Magnolia, and University of Arkansas at Monticello. He established high schools, reformed schools for youth, pushed for better teacher salaries, and believed in compulsory or required education. He won a second term in 1910. He is defeated for a third term by Jyoti Robinson. Donahey believed that reason and science could make people's lives better, a very progressive way of thinking. He saw that prisoners were treated harshly and abused in jails across the state, and the inmates were overworked, and Donahey wanted to bring an end to this. He, before leaving office in 1913, pardoned 360 inmates in an attempt to end the convict leasing program, which is described in the Arkansas history textbook, Arkansas Concise History, as well as in an encyclopedia article on the Arkansas Online Encyclopedia. So be sure you look into that. After leaving office, he dedicated himself to charity work, helped with an endowment to Little Rock Junior College, which is now the University of Arkansas at Little Rock. He suffered a heart attack on December 13th, 1937, at 81 years old. The progressiveness he established stayed in Arkansas after he left office. Considerable progress is made during Donahey's time as governor, and Donahey even had a proposal to rewrite the Constitution. Another very progressive thought. His opponents, however, argued that this would raise taxes. During this time, people started to see better salaries, a decline of illiteracy. There was a state board of health, state transportation. The problem was how to pay for these services if people weren't willing to pay more taxes. Also, during this time, race relations are not getting any better. They're honestly getting worse. Let's talk about prohibition. This is the effort to limit or ban the sale or consumption of alcohol. Arkansas always had attempts to eliminate sale and consumption of alcohol in some form. Think about dry counties, mentioned those a minute ago. The organized temperance movement in Arkansas began in earnest with the formation in 1831 the Little Rock Temperance Society, right? So, which was closely aligned also with local churches. Okay, Methodists were usually the most ardent in supporting prohibition, while Baptists were not widely involved in opposing alcohol until after the Civil War. At first, Arkansas temperance advocates spoke against whiskey and other hard liquors, while tactically condoning beer and wine consumption. Significantly, the Little Rock Temperance Society, unlike other such organizations, allowed women to join its ranks, opening the door for greater female participation in state politics. Women eventually formed the heart of the prohibition movement in Arkansas, opposing alcohol as a threat to the family structure. Now, the prohibition movement gained momentum in the first decade of the 20th century as Arkansas, and indeed much of the nation, continued to ban saloons. In 1906, 60% of American towns had done so. And the Anti-Saloon League, founded in 1899, urged for more restrictions in this period. Arkansas governors such as George Donahey would lead a fight for tighter control of alcohol. Now, race played a role in local referendums in 1913 when the legislature passed a bill that required petitions in support of a new saloon to be signed by a majority of white voters. In an era of widespread African American voter disenfranchisement, black opinion on alcohol was simply ignored or suppressed. By 1914, only 9 counties had managed to keep their saloons open. In 1915, the General Assembly passed the Newberry Act, effectively banning the manufacture and sale of alcohol in the state. In addition, the act failed to exempt the sale of alcohol for medicinal purposes. During the 20s, Temperance formed an unlikely partnership with the resurgent Ku Klux Klan, which claimed to have over 50,000 members in Arkansas at its peak. Right? For instance, Lula Markwell, former president of the Arkansas chapter of the WCTU, was the imperial commander of the women of the Ku Klux Klan. Jyoti Robinson, a longtime Democratic senator from Arkansas, was never a supporter of prohibition, and he used the sweeping Democratic Party victory in the 1932 elections as an opportunity to draft legislation ending prohibition. The onset of the Great Depression, this had encouraged many Americans to view repealing the ban of alcohol as economically beneficial. Indeed, by the early 30s, the public's mood toward alcohol had softened. With the repeal of the 18th Amendment in 1933, the entire state was once again wet. While the national prohibition movement collapsed following World War II, Arkansas temperance advocates still pushed for dry counties, but also had to reconcile with Arkansas's changing attitudes towards consumption. Efforts to prohibit the sale and consumption of alcohol have existed throughout Arkansas's history from before the territorial era to the present day. I made mention of this man a couple of times already, Jyoti Robinson. He's the 23rd governor of Arkansas. He's elected in 1913. Joseph Taylor Robinson, governor for a short time before taking office as a U.S. senator. He became Senate Majority Leader during the Great Depression after his nomination as the Democratic Party candidate for vice president, the first Southern office holder on a major ticket after the Civil War. Robinson's career took many rapid turns. In 1912, he announced he would run for the Senate against incumbent Jeff Davis. But after assessing Davis's strength, he changed his mind. He ran for governor instead, besting Donahey by nearly a 2-1 margin. Before Robinson's inauguration, the recently reelected Davis died of a heart attack. Robinson won a close vote for Davis's Senate seat. As Governor Robinson pushed through a progressive agenda for the state, he proposed the legislature enact laws creating a state banking board, a state health board, and the Arkansas Highway Commission. He also oversaw the reform of penitentiary systems, including a paid oversight board, and outlawing the notorious convict leasing program. He also worked for ratification of the 17th Amendment and the direct election of senators by the people. But on March 8th, 1913, he resigned the governorship to take his Senate seat, causing a crisis in the state as Arkansas did not have the position of lieutenant governor. In the Senate, Robinson became a politician of national stature. He stood by President Woodrow Wilson, leading fights for progressive legislation, such as a proposal to end child labor and for wartime measures, the arming of merchant ships, and the declaration of war against Germany in 1917. After the war, he helped direct the unsuccessful battle for ratification of the Versailles Treaty, earning a reputation as a master tactician and excellent parliamentarian. In recognition of his efforts, he was chosen as the permanent chairman of the 1920 Democratic National Convention. His fame and power grew throughout the 20s. In 1923, he became Democratic leader of the Senate. As the Great Depression of the 1930s grew, so did Robinson's prestige. After the 1932 election, with the Democrats in control of the federal government, Robinson became majority leader of the Senate. From this position, he pushed FDR's New Deal legislation through a sometimes reluctant Senate. In 1933, he guided the Emergency Banking Act through the Senate and introduced and pushed for Relief Act, the Work Relief Act, the Homeowners Loan Act, and also the Railroad Coordination Act. One more time on those: conservation corps, civilian conservation corps, the Federal Emergency Relief Act, the Work Relief Act, the Homeowners Loan Act, and the Railroad Coordination Act. Robinson's career came to an end in 1937 during one of the most heated Senate conflicts of the 20th century: Roosevelt's plan to enlarge the Supreme Court. In June of 1937, Roosevelt offered Robinson a seat on the court if he could get the Senate to support up to 6 new justices. For the next month, Robinson led the floor fight in a bitter battle over the Roosevelt proposal in the hot Senate chamber. Suddenly, on July 14th, 1937, this skirmish in the Senate ended when Robinson died in his apartment, apparently the victim of a heart attack. So post-World War I, let's talk about a few things in relation to this era. 1917 through 1920, okay? So Arkansas is flourishing throughout World War I. The United States is entering the war with this idealism that they would make the world safe for democracy. Now, after World War I, for example, the Elaine riots, and there was a reversal of Arkansas fortunes after World War I. Agriculture is hit very hard. Prices start declining from 1919 to 1921. Arkansas loses manufacturing companies. Banks are in trouble. And in September of 1920, cotton is 6 cents per pound and keeps declining, which leads to an agricultural depression. The flood of 27 is going to cause some serious issues and devastate Arkansas. And there's also a boll weevil infestation. Efficiency is declining, and the timber industry is also in decline. The urban middle class movement was growing, and so were cities. Even in the 1920s, major trends come to an end. The Great Depression sees an economic downturn, which begins in Arkansas years before the crash of the stock market in 29. The 20s weren't quite so roaring in Arkansas. An already bad economy was falling to lower levels. From 1920 to 1935, there's a movement of people going back to the land to survive. It's also a time of increasing dramatic and undesired change. The conservative reaction against progressiveness in the 1920s, a couple of things, fundamentalist religion and the rise of conservative politics. Now, in terms of fundamentalist religion, ideas here would be literal interpretation of the Bible, belief in the virgin birth, physical resurrection, and second coming of Jesus, prohibited and opposed teaching evolution. Evolution was condemned in Arkansas in 1924 when an act was initiated where people started a bill to recall the law. A petition or initiative to pass law against evolution is passed, but eventually overturned. The rise of conservative politics in Arkansas, or the rise of the second, or the resurgent KKK, or the second rise of the KKK. And the second KKK opposed wife beaters, Catholics, Jews, immigrants, foreigners, bootleggers, anything they deemed un-American. Okay. The greatest strength in the for the Klan was in the Midwest and Indiana in the 1920s, and up to 25,000 strong in Arkansas during this time. They claimed, as I mentioned previously, to be as strong as 50,000. Many prominent leaders in the state were a part of the Klan. They claimed to be attempting to preserve morality and saw themselves as guardians of old Victorian morality. KKK tried to take over the political party of the Democrats, and candidates had to have the endorsement of the Klan. This led to a backlash. This is a backlash, rather, against progressivism. Arkansas continued to make some progress despite the social, political, and economic climate of the state. Carl Moneyhan states that the events of the 20s brought major trends to an end, that the Great Depression and economic downturn began years before the stock market crash. The 20s, again, not so roaring in Arkansas, and the already bad economy is suffering and falling to lower levels. The New South movement is illusory at the end of the 1920s. From Reconstruction until the end of Reconstruction until 1929, there are closer links to the national economy and national culture. Agricultural society has weak support Race relations are at the lowest point in the history of the New South, particularly in Elaine, Arkansas, where they are arguably the toughest. So I'm going to talk with you about the Elaine Massacre of 1919. It's a very intense and unfortunate event in our state's history. So let's talk about the Elaine Massacre. In 1917, African Americans had served the country in World War I. Following World War I, in 1919, race riots occur in 350 cities across the United States. And the Elaine Massacre was by far the deadliest racial confrontation in Arkansas history, and possibly one of the bloodiest racial conflicts in the history of the United States. It is. While its deepest roots lie in the state's commitment to white supremacy, the events of Elaine stem from tense racial relations and growing concerns about labor unions. And this leads to an incident which occurred at a meeting of the Progressive Farmers and Household Union, which escalates into mob violence on the part of the white people in Elaine, which is located in Phillips County in surrounding areas. Although the exact number is unknown, estimates of the number of African Americans killed by whites range into the hundreds, while 5 white people lost their lives. The conflict began on the night of September 30th, 1919, when approximately 100 African Americans, mostly sharecroppers on plantations of white landowners, attended a meeting of the Progressive Farmers and Household Unions of America at a church in Phillips County, 3 miles north of Elaine. Black sharecroppers in Elaine were trying to obtain better payments for their cotton crops from white plantation owners who dominated the area during this Jim Crow period. These individuals were often exploited in their efforts to collect payments for their cotton crops. Sharecropping was keeping laborers in debt and creating a cycle that they would never get out of. White law enforcement comes to the meeting. A white man is shot. More whites come back and shoot up the blacks. 25 blacks and 5 whites are killed in this exchange. Right? Now, some say that the grand total moving forward from this incident, and including this incident, that there's as many as 200 blacks killed and dumped in the Mississippi River. Before its end, the event sees machine gun crews holding African Americans in concentration camps. African Americans were burned, whipped, and beaten. Evidence shows that mobs of whites slaughtered African Americans in and around Elaine. For example, H.F. Smitty, one of the white witnesses at the massacre, swore in eyewitness account in 1921 that several hundred of them began to hunt Negroes and shotting them as they came to them. Anecdotal evidence also suggests that the troops from Camp Pike engaged in indiscriminate killing of African Americans in the area, which, if true, was a replication of past militia activity to put down perceived black revolts. In 1925, Sharp Dunaway, an employee of the the Arkansas Gazette, alleged that soldiers in Elaine had committed one murder after another with all the calm deliberation in the world, either too heartless to realize the enormity of their crimes or too drunk on moonshine to give a continental darn. Within days of the initial shootout, 285 African Americans were taken away from temporary stockades to the jail in Helena, the county seat, although the jail had only space for 48. 2 white members of the Phillips County posse, T.K. Jones and H.F. Smitty, stated in sworn affidavits that they, in 1921, that they committed acts of torture at the Phillips County Jail and named others who also participated in the torture. On October 13th, 1919, the Phillips County grand jury charged 122 African Americans with crimes stemming from the racial disturbances. The charges range from night riding, a charge akin to terroristic threatening. The trials began the next week. White attorneys from Helena were appointed by Circuit Judge J.M. Jackson to represent the first 12 black men to go to trial. Attorney Jacob Fink was appointed to represent Frank Hicks, and they admitted to the jury that they had not interviewed any witnesses. He made no motion for a change of venue, nor did he challenge a single prospective juror, taking the first 12 jurors they called. By November 5th, 1919, the first 12 black men given trials had been convicted of murder and were sentenced to die in the electric chair. And as a result of this, 65 others quickly enter plea bargains and accept sentences of up to 21 years for second-degree murder. Others had their charges dismissed or ultimately were not prosecuted. Had they had pleaded guilty and not taking these, or had they not taken these bargains, they would have been lynched by a mob. Following this event, both blacks and whites ignored what had happened out of fear. In Little Rock and at the headquarters of the NAACP in New York, efforts began to fight the death sentences handed down in Helena, led in part by a man named Scipio Africanus Jones. That is, if you want to look up Scipio Africanus is a famous figure in history that was able to defeat Carthage for Rome, right? Rome was getting their butt kicked by the Carthaginians, and Scipio is the one guy that's able to turn it all around for them, like really like their savior. Now, Scipio Jones of Little Rock is the leading black attorney of his era in Arkansas, and he began to raise money in the black community in Little Rock for the defense of the Elaine 12, as the convicted men came to be known. The case of the Elaine 12 were litigated on two separate tracks, and the retrials of the defendants began May 3rd, 1920. During the trials, Murphy becomes ill and Jones becomes principal counsel. Hostility towards him was so great from local white residents that out of fear for his life, he was said to sleep at a different black family's home every night during the trials. The convictions were again affirmed. Now, Governor Brough, B-R-O-U-G-H, or Brough, once again stayed their executions until the Arkansas Supreme Court could again review the cases. Ultimately, the defendants were freed by the Arkansas Supreme Court after 2 terms of court had passed, and the state of Arkansas made no moves to retry the men. In 1925, all that had been charged were released. So, if you want to do a little additional research, look into what I was talking about. There are over 350 of these events that happen across the United States in 1919. Elaine is one. Okay. So look into that. If you want to look a little bit about, there's some articles online by the professor I mentioned earlier, Dr. Lerner, that talk about some of these riots and talk about African Americans in World War I and how they went to fight for our country, but they didn't emerge with any more mobility or rights or respect or anything, right? But that was the assumption, is that that is what they would be able to achieve. Okay. So that is all for Chapter 11, everybody. I appreciate you listening. Let me know if you have any questions. You can write them in the comments, or you can send me an email, wilson@uaccm.edu, or I'm sure you can find me online somehow, right? Thanks for listening once again. We'll talk to you all soon.